Hey, so welcome to another episode of Out of the Fire podcast. And today we have a very special person on with us, which is Joshua Kelly. I would start by asking you to introduce yourself and just kind of tell us who you are.
Well, it's good. Great to be here. I'm Josh, also Joshua, but that's more of something my mom calls me. So I'm the CTO and one of the co-founders at Flexpa, which we'll talk about a bunch, I'm sure. The short version of Flexpa is that we make claims data really easy to get and to use and make useful. And we do that with patient access, direct patient consented flow. Otherwise, I'm a YC founder. So I went through Y Combinator in winter 20, which was a really fun batch. It was the COVID batch. Previously, I worked at another startup outside of healthcare called Universe, and we did online ticketing, online events, all the way back to 2011. So doing startups and startup-like things for most of my career. And on the healthcare side, Flexpa wasn't the first company that we sort of tried to form in the healthcare space. We actually, and the official parent company is called Automate Medical. And we initially actually started back in 21 trying to automate the interpretation of pulmonary function tests, which is kind of random, but that was a really interesting learning experience and sort of trial by fire in working with healthcare data. So yeah, today, working at Flexpa, I've been a speaker at FHIR Dev Days, really interested in the broad gamut of FHIR topics, healthcare topics, startups.
It's interesting that you kind of came out of the non-traditional healthcare system background, which I think a lot of the founders and folks that are working in the digital health space, you see that quite a bit. What do you think makes healthcare different than other industries, I guess, to start out with? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I love that question because I've worked in different industries, and after a while, you start to realize that the things that the outsiders think, they might be right about some things, but they're wrong about others. And I'll answer this in sort of a roundabout way. The thing that I learned about the event and ticketing business was that actually people think that that's a technology business. It's a technology services business. Like you're selling tickets on. Everyone's been through the experience of being in the waiting room or paying too much for the tickets or all this stuff. It all seems like it's technology services, but it's not. It's actually a financial services business. Whole business runs on financial services deals. So if you're an event promoter or a big concert, for example, you need financing well in advance of the event, and you will go to one of these companies and get financial services from them, effectively banking and loan making. So that really drives a lot of decision making, and that was a really interesting revelation to me. It wasn't technology. On the healthcare side, that's a good question. I think one thing that I've come to understand that wasn't as obvious from I think there's two layers to this. One is just in general, like healthcare data systems, what's interesting or surprising about them. I think one thing is the level and the degree to which terminology really matters and drives the whole thing. Terminology is the healthcare data as far as I'm concerned. Like at some level, everything else exists just to transport codable concepts and codings and core terminologies, and everything else is sort of just a wrapper around that. Maybe you need some kind of eventing that you're also sort of indicating on, but at the heart of it is codable systems and codable terminologies. And I think that was a really interesting thing to learn, and maybe that's totally naive, right? But I'm also sort of in the position of being the barbarian at the gates, right? So I'm not the health informaticist. I'm not coming from it from that perspective. I'm coming from it from an entrepreneurial background, from certainly like a patient perspective and a patient access perspective in particular. But that was less obvious at the outset. And then the other way I want to answer that question is in terms of interoperability. Interoperability gets such a tremendous amount of attention and resourcing, and it takes up so much space. And at the end of the day, I think the degree to which interoperability today actually like delivers on its promise is a little bit, maybe a little bit questionable. I think it's at least more questionable than if you're really on the inside of it, then that you might kind of want to admit maybe. But yeah, that's a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, that's great. And I have a ton of questions, obviously, as follow-up, and we can go pretty deep, like totally nerd out on this terminology stuff. And then FHIR, I don't know if you've seen some of my posts, but that's exactly like the stuff that I love to like jump into and look at and just kind of like dispel some of the myths and some of the things that people make assumptions around. But really, and when talking about FHIR specifically, it's almost like a container, right? So like FHIR, all the EMRs that are out there, right, that where healthcare journey begins, right, where healthcare data is born, are not FHIR native, right? They're not FHIR. There's some FHIR-based EMRs out there that are being like created across the world, but like most like Epic, and they have very specific workflows, and they're not built in FHIR, right? FHIR is kind of like a mechanism to transport and kind of apply this modern API standard to it, but the terminology itself is dependent very much on the specific workflows at the source. And I think it's interesting that you guys are focusing on basically the payer space and the claims data, because that's really where everything ends up, and then how ultimately everything gets paid and all of this stuff that we know from the meaningful use, EMR era of Epic and Cerner, and why now every healthcare organization in the country has an EMR and it's certified, and is because we spent billions of dollars as a country mandating that, right? But I think it was done to enable the billing workflows, and the billing workflows are the coding, the terminologies, right? Like how does the provider get paid for doing the service, which is in our country still majority fee for service, right? So like, what are your thoughts on some of the things that are happening now around mandates, and that we've seen with the CMS RFI? And I think it's interesting you mentioned interoperability, issues with interoperability, because I think that's the most common theme from what I can tell on the Josh Mundell, the site he created to aggregate all the responses. Interoperability gaps, I think, is like literally the number one issue that everyone sees, that true interoperability really has not taken hold. Do you feel terminology is one of the reasons why? And then what do you feel like is the next step, like, to
Yeah,
address that?
I want to answer that just from local perspectives. Our local perspective it does have some idiosyncrasies that others may not have, but I think in a lot of ways we are at the edge of something that's happening, and so we might be seeing things before other folks are. So just maybe keep that in mind. But the payer space that you mentioned, yeah, we operate and aggregate data from every payer who implements a CMS 9115 API. So these are the payer patient access APIs. People might be familiar with patient access on the EHR side, or the clinical patient access APIs. The payer APIs are very similar, but they're different. They're different in a couple of ways. They're different in the data that they make available. So they make available principally the patient coverage and explanation of benefit resources. And the explanation of benefit is really the center of it. Officially, on paper, payers do have to make available US CDI, so US core resources as well. And there's varying levels of conformance there, but the explanation of benefit is the heart of this resource. It basically comes from pre-existing claims sources. So it comes from UB04, CMS 1500, 1450, and CPDP transaction. So every payer is maintaining different claims standards and different claims formats. Those forms are ultimately represented in X12 transactions, right? And 837. I want to make sure I get all the numbers right? But it's pre-existing, right? And before, really, the X12 transaction was the thing that was interoperable, or maybe even the standardized form in some sense, right? That the CMS 1500 form is a standardized PDF, right? That gets represented in X12. So those have some degree of interoperability already. The thing that we see that is sort of challenging about saying everything is interoperable now, like where is the limit of this, is at the network level. So we've made over 300 connections. So as a third party, we've made 300 different FHIR connections. So we have one of the largest, if not the largest, I call it maybe private or third party FHIR network. So it's not built on top of Kafka. We're not inside of a QHIN. We're operating independently as a third party patient access application. And so because of that, that gives us a really interesting perspective on interoperability at a network level. So one of the challenges that we have on the terminology side is just conformity to, and I think a payer understanding or understanding how to translate those prior formats into FHIR and how to represent them as FHIR. So for example, I think just to call it one, ICD-10, the representation, or not ICD-10, but ICD in general. The representation of ICD in FHIR is actually a fairly complex topic. Even if you look at the THO IG, there's actually a special landing page just for the subject of ICD. There are lots of different subtle differences in the ways that payers represent ICD. There are also lots of silly sort of errors. The one that I love to mention, I mentioned on LinkedIn and X a bunch, is the value set misunderstanding. So this is a really basic one. Graham Grieve at some point, I found a clip of him saying that value set was one of like the worst mistakes that FHIR's ever made in calling it, because like, what the heck's a value set? And it, like, indeed, what is a value set? And the name doesn't connote really anything about its meaning. It sounds abstract. It sounds typey, but really, right, it's a list of options, the list of options. So one of the misunderstandings about value sets is the representation of the canonical value set URL as the system URL. So if we're trying to code and represent an ICD-10 CM code, there are lots of implementations that will use the literal canonical URL for the value set itself as the system, which is problematic when the value set could include multiple different coding systems, right? So now you have to disambiguate based on the actual code. Is this code actually part of, a better example would be HCPCS level 1 and level 2. So CPT versus HCPCS level 2 codes. Well, you can sift that out if you understand the codes well enough. You can say, well, okay, if it starts with a number, then it's going to be a CPT code. If it starts with a letter or anything else, it will be HCPCS level 2. But that kind of ambiguity, as a single simple example of a misunderstanding of what a value set is, really ripples out at a network level. So when you have many, many, many different institutions, hundreds potentially, trying to operate and interoperate at a national scale with FHIR and the representation of terminologies in particular, I think there are challenges with that haven't been really appreciated fully, because the level of national exchange that's going on is not where it will be. And so we're sort of at the edge of, especially in the payer space, but that's still very much emergent. I think it's the operations purpose of use is still sort of fledgling. That's the example from kind of what we see is to link those two ideas together is terminologies, representation of terminologies, and creating national FHIR exchange definitely act as that in practice is acting as a limiter. And what would help? Well, conformity. So conformance testing, making it easier to do conformance testing. When CMS in particular announces new requirements, to make sure that those are backed by conformance testing. And they've partnered with AST/UNC on Inferno tests recently, but that was a little bit of an afterthought when it comes to the payer patient access APIs. So my hope for CMS 0057, which is the prior auth API, payer to provider, and payer to payer APIs, is that by 2027, that there's enough conformance testing in the wild to make it all work. Otherwise, I think people are going to see what we see today, and they're going to scratch their heads and say, how did we ever kind of get to this spot? Again, that's a local perspective. It's not everyone's going to see that and say, hey, the national exchange of terminologies is a really big deal. But from our little view of the world, it acts as a big limiter to national exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's something comes to mind, maybe as a challenge, but what do you think about putting something out there that people can use to try to address the problem? and maybe we can work together and partner on that with FHIR, which is my venture. And part of it is maybe putting a standardized open source EOB validator out there, or a coverage validator with using MCP, a plugin to any FHIR server, and making it really easy and simple for people to use. What do you think about that? And
Yeah,
do you accept the challenge?
yeah, I think in general, just the claims data as a subject really needs better public resources and better tooling. So really, at like anything at this point, there's a lot of low hanging fruit. I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of low hanging fruit, and just even just aggregating information. But as far as MCP and validation, I think there's a lot, there's a big role for that to play. And actually, on the subject, one of the things that I think might happen is in in terms of these more complicated APIs, especially the prior auth API. I don't know if you've seen the diagram of some of the workflows in prior auth and on the DaVinci side.
Yep.
And it's just like, it reminds me of the DoD. The DoD has some crazy diagrams that have come out over the years of like very complex information systems and warfare and all these things, and they're just like the most insane, crazy diagrams. It looks like one of those. It looks like something out of some crazy CIA project. And I remember being at Dev Days last year, and in the presentation on it, and just kind of shaking my head. But I think that MCP type work, I think that we're going to see over the next year some big opportunities. And so it might be validation to start. I think you're onto something there, or in just helping an implementing team understand how to take some of these old data sources like X12 and do the conversion and the mapping. I think there's some really low hanging fruit there in terms of a validator or educational resources. But then bigger picture, I think some of those technologies will also be really, really useful in making real some of these more advanced APIs that on paper just seem so complex that I'm not sure I'm not sure they'll get to production. I think they may not. They're so complex that there's a little bit of an opportunity for maybe some parallel development in some way, like a parallel path with LLMs and MCP and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So yeah, that's very inspirational. And I think I agree that it's a low-hanging fruit, because every time you start talking about validation with anybody that works with FHIR, you get this really like bad facial expression. The person obviously like is like, oh no, not that, like don't bring that up, that's horrible. And that's why people say, like, that's why the state of APIs is where it's at, right? Because I think what we saw with CMS-RFI is that it's like checkbox compliance, and you probably see that in the payer space all the time, because I think
100%.
payers are probably as guilty of that as anybody, is that, they just, let's implement this, let's do this, let's put some money aside to do this thing,
It's
but
just
it's
compliance.
not part of our overall strategy, or the
Yeah.
$1 billion we've spent on our whole tech stack, or if we're a large health insurance plan, right? It's just another thing that sits on top somewhere, and nobody has really thought about it. And I think that's the issue, is that you can't approach it that way because of the terminology issue that you brought up with the code systems and the value stats. And I personally have seen Epic, which is probably has more APIs in FHIR than anybody else out there, right? They just recently mandated, I think it was sometime last year, that like URI has to be actually valid in instead of just sending an OID, for example. So like even they are playing catch up, even though, in many respects they say they're leading the charge, which they might be in some areas in the US CDI version 3 and things like that. But I've seen these, like, obviously nobody has thought of this, and they just threw a bunch of data into the structure, right? When they did their mappings, and they didn't really think about the validation part of it. So, and now basically what's happening is everybody that's connecting to that data is inheriting all the issues that brings with it, right? Which is like limited usability, things like that. Check out part 2 of our conversation with Josh Kelly next week on Out of the FHIR podcast.